Hey everyone, it's 10 Types, and today I'm going to be going over 10 cards that every Pokemon TCG player needs to have. These cards aren't necessarily going in every single deck, although some probably are, but you're probably going to be including around 8 of these cards in every single deck, so yeah, they're pretty important. You don't necessarily need 4 of all these cards. The items you probably do. I'll talk about that when I get there, but I do have an honorable mention though, and by the way, they're all trainers, because trainers are the most universal cards because Pokemon, they change from deck to deck, and same thing with energies, though you should have energies. But I do have Prime Catcher as an honorable mention here. Prime Catcher is a very powerful item card. It's an Spec card. It says switch in one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to the active spot. This is what's called Gusting, just the switching a bench to the active of your choice generally, and it's really important. And then it says if you do switch your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon, so it's also a switch effect. These are both really important effects, but we're going to talk about them later on, and there are other cards that do this, so it's important, but it's also an ace spec, and there's a bunch of them. I don't remember how many there are off the top of my head, maybe around um, I think there's 13 now and 3 in the next mini set. And then we'll get some in the next mini set as well. So there's a good chunk of them, and they're pretty much all viable in some level. Even the weakest ones do see play. So you don't need Prime Catcher by any means. It's certainly not a bad idea to have, and it's an ace spec card, and the ace spec card that can go in any deck. Unfair Stamp, Secret Box, Legacy Energy, Scupo Cyclone can also really slide into most decks with and get solid value. Maybe not Secret Box or Legacy Energy in all the decks. But certainly Unfair Stamp can go into really any deck, and it's a really good card. So Prime Catcher though is also it's just so versatile and universal, but there are other cards that do similar things that aren't ace spec, so you definitely understand that you don't need Prime Catcher in every deck, and there's a reason that not every deck plays it. And of course, Prime Catcher is switches, but what card switches better? Switch. This is very common. It's been around for I don't know if it's been around the entire TCG or just most of it, but certainly in the whole modern history, we've had Switch like all the time. So arguably the best card ever because it's been out for forever. I'd probably say it's the best card ever because it's just been, it's been in so many decks for so long. But yeah, you switch in one of your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. I mean, it's just so important. It allows you to do a wide variety of things. Of course, they're all switching, but the first one is, of course, the obvious. If you just have the wrong Pokemon in the active, say you start the wrong Pokemon, you can use this to switch. Additionally, if your opponent bosses orders up, which we'll talk about, or prime catchers, or whatever, gusts up, one of your bench Pokemon that you don't want in the active, that they're trying to get it stuck in the active, you can switch to get out of that. So that's, not voluntary, nor starting the wrong Pokemon. But then there are times when you want to switch between different attackers and you don't want to retreat. You can always, or you can generally retreat and not switch, not play switch. There are certain decks that do that. If your deck is not playing any switches because you have ways to retreat easier, but that is a little risky because there are certain Pokemon that stop you from retreating, but they don't stop switch. Of course, there are things that stop you from playing items, and so, switch can lose value there, but that's not that common, especially now. So Switch is so good. And then also there are effects of attacks. These can be things like special conditions, but they can also be, again, the not retreating thing, although that's kind of weird to talk about in this circumstance because you're going to be playing Switch. But also, like, not being able to attack. So if you have a Pokemon like Miraidon EX, the Lightning Miraidon EX from Scarlet and Violet base set, that card has an attack and it can't attack again next turn. So, that's obviously something you want to be able to do. So you can play Switch to remove any effects of attacks, then switch back into the active or retreat or whatever. But you could just play 2 Switch cards and then you can attack again. And that's really nice, as opposed to having to set up a whole nother attacker, which is much more difficult to do. So Switch is really useful there. As I said, if there's some like weird effect of an attack on you, including special conditions, which aren't necessarily always effects of attacks, but they sometimes are. But special conditions will always be removed if you switch in and out. Effective abilities will not, so keep that in mind. Like if you have, say, Comfy, if you switch in and out of the active, you can't use its ability again. However, if you switch Comfy in and out of the active, you can switch it into another Comfy. Comfy has an ability that works in the active spot, and so you can switch into different comfies and then use multiple of your abilities every single turn, which is really useful and really another very important use of it. Lost Zone decks, which are built around comfy, play a lot of switch, anywhere from I think the lower end's like 6 I personally always play 8. That's really how many you can easily play. You play 4 Switch and then 4 Switch card. There was a card called Escape Rope that made Switch less relevant. Sometimes that's in the format, and it's arguably better than Switch, but it's not always in the format. And right now, it's not in the format. And then Switch card certainly not always better than Switch, but um, yeah, Switch is just so important. And as I said, Prime Catcher does something similar, but it's different, and it's your A spec card. Next up, we have the other aspect of Prime Catcher, which is gusting in the form of counter catcher, and also Boss's Orders. Boss's Orders says switch in one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to their active spot as a supporter. Counter catcher says you can only play this if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, aka you're losing, but then you do the same thing. Counter catcher, I imagine there are some people who don't think this card needs to be on the list, but this card is so good. Counter catcher certainly is not played in every deck, but it's played in a lot of decks, and obviously, you want to be, if you're up on prizes the whole game, you just sweep your opponent. That's all good, but that's not going to happen that commonly, especially in the current standard format where a lot of Pokemon give up 2 prizes, meaning that um, if the first player takes a knockout on a single prizer, and then every knockout after that is on a 2-prize Pokemon, and a knockout's happening every single turn, then Counter Catcher can be played essentially the entire game. Of course, that's not actually going to happen in reality. It's just only going to be active some of the time, but Boss's Orders, so good. It's a supporter, though. You can only play 1 supporter per turn, but really good. This card's in, like, so many decks. Like, I'm just going to scroll through. Oh, I'm just going to scroll through all the decks that have it. It is actually, like, lagging, so I will not do that. But, yeah, Boss's Orders, so good. It's probably not going to rotate from format. So, rotation, if you don't know, rotation is pretty much the idea that every a year will rotate or will not be able to be played in the standard format 3 years after it's printed around. So, or rather, it's the last 3 years of cards being printed. So you're allowed to play. So sometimes cards are reprinted, and we've seen this with Switch. I said it was like in the format for forever, pretty much. So Switch was like reprinted over and over and over again. Cards like Counter Catcher. Counter Catcher has been printed twice, so we can take a look. It's played here in 2024, a bunch, and then 2024, and this might be 2023, but I think it's mostly 2024. And as I said, these cards are played a lot. This is like one of the least played cards in this list. And then here, and then all of a sudden here, this is 2019, right? So big drop off, not played from like 2020 to 2022 because it just wasn't in the format. I don't know if those are quite the right years, but from that time, it just wasn't in format. Most cards, most Pokemon, I should say, are never reprinted. They're just in the format for 2 years, whatever. Rotation has changed over time, and then they're gone, right? So you play them, and then you stop playing them. But with trainers, they will stay in the format. So Counter Catcher is sometimes in the format. Boss's Orders is weird. There was a card called Lysander, more or less the same as Boss's Orders. There's also a card called Pokemon Catcher, and then Gust of Wind, and the Guzman. There's a bunch of different cards that are kind of like it. But since then, well, Pokemon Catcher is still in the game, but that's another story. But Boss's Orders is a card. It's called Boss's Orders Getsis, but the card name is Boss's Orders. We've seen Boss's Orders with different bosses. We saw Getsis, not Guzma. We saw Lysander. We saw, I think, Cyrus, and we saw Giovanni. So different variations of the same card. And so that kind of makes me think that these cards are never going to rotate. Pokemon doesn't want them to leave the game, and they want to balance the game around these cards. So with these cards being good. So Boss Orders will probably be good for a really long time. I imagine like certainly 5 years from now, I gotta imagine that Boss Orders is still going to be really good. Obviously, having your cards valuable for 5 years versus just a year. Let's be honest, a lot of people watching this video won't be playing the Pokemon TCG in a year from now. I know that's how it works, or certainly 5 years from now. I certainly hope I will be doing it, but I know that a lot of people like it very casually. So certainly getting Counter Catcher when it might rotate is not like an issue, and it's still good for another like couple of years. But Counter Catcher is still so good because it's an item, so you can play as many of these as you want per turn. I mentioned the effects of attacks thing. There are some good effects of attacks. So, for example, Terrakion. Terrakion's not a very good Pokemon, but there's a Terrakion that's invincible when you attack with it. But if you use Counter Catcher to bring it out of the active, then you can play another Counter Catcher to bring it back in, or you can play Counter Catcher plus Boss's Orders. So really good there. And then in control-based decks, those are decks where you're not really taking many prizes. So you can pretty much play Counter Catcher the entire game. I play a lot of control-based decks, and Counter Catcher is really good. In the deck, Gardevoir, Counter Catcher is really good. And in most decks, it's pretty solid, but some decks, it's truly amazing. Boss Orders is pretty good in every deck. You're not going to be playing 4 copies really, but you can play 1 to 3. 2 is very common, and it's just a really good card. Of course, you need to be able to play your cards, but you need to be able to play them again if they get discarded. This can be due to a variety of circumstances. Pokemon, they can get knocked out. Cards can just get discarded from your cards that discard cards, which is not that big of a deal usually, but there are times when it's awkward. And then they can also be discarded from your opponent's cards. And, things just happen. Your cards are going to end up getting discarded, and so you need some way to recover them. And say with supporters, you're going to play a bunch of supporters or items. You'll play a bunch of items. It's really hard to recover items, pretty hard to recover tools and special energies, but basic energies. And Pokemon, you have Super Rod here which says shuffle up to 3 in any combination of Pokemon and basic energy cards from your discard pile back into your deck. This is the best or the second best recovery card in the game because it just recovers your Pokemon and also your basic energies. So there are other ways of recovering basic energies, and in the next expansion or mini expansion, Shrouded Fable or Night Wanderer in Japan, it's there's a card called Nightly Stretcher or something. I don't know. We don't know the international translation, or I don't know the international translation just yet. It recovers a Pokemon or item, or sorry, Pokemon or energy, basic energy from your discard into your hand. Super Rod is, recovers 3 cards into your deck, so a little different, but Nightly Stretcher not in the game right now. Super Rod though is so good because it recovers your Pokemon or basic energy, and you can just search them out of your deck pretty easily. We'll talk about that as well later on. But Super Rod is so good because you need to be able to use your Pokemon. One common use, or one way you can get super high value out of Super Rod is you can play a bunch of different attackers, say the Lost Zone deck, or the Gardevoir deck, right? So let's take a look at the North American International Championship. Normally, I don't put too much value in tournament results because they often show a limited meta, like it's just the meta of one specific like 2 or 3 day period. However, this is really interesting, and the Lost Zone came in 1st and 8th. So looking at the top 8 is generally something that people do commonly, and then 2nd through 7th were all Gardevoir decks. They each play. I actually don't know exactly what's in these lists, but if we look at the lists, the main attackers here. Well, all the attack Comfrey's not really an attacker, so all the other Pokemon, they're not all attackers, but they're mostly attackers. You only play 1 copy of each of them, and then you look at Gardevoir here, and you have a bunch of different attackers. Gardevoir EX can attack, I guess, and Curly and Ralts too, but not really. But and Monkey is not an attacker, but Drifloon, Screamtail, Fluttermane, Cresselia, maybe Klefki. I don't play Gardevoir, but mostly, your attackers. You only have 1 copy of all your attackers. This means that if they get knocked out, then it's gone. But you have Super Rod. You have 2 Super Rod in this deck, 4 Super Rod in this deck. Yeah, Super Rod is just super powerful. There's a card called Ordinary Rod, which admittedly was about as powerful as Super Rod, but this is so good. It means you can recover your attacker. So instead of playing 2 copies of all your attackers, you can play 1 copy of all your attackers and a Super Rod or 2. So it just saves so much deck space, and it's really good. Then recovering the energies is nice. It depends. Lost Zone really likes recovering the energies because you get energies out of the deck, and then there are certain other decks that do that, but it's like the energy recovery is nice, but it's more of like a backup option or a nice supporting effect. And the Pokemon recovery is the main thing here, and it's super good. Next, we have Palpad. This is the other really good recovery option. I guess Super Rod's probably better than Palpad, but Palpad's really good. I'm a control player, as I said earlier, not exclusively a control player. I play more non-control than control, but I play more control than the average player. And Palpad's super broken in control, but Palpad says shuffle 2 supporter cards from your disco pile, or up to 2 supporter cards from your disco pile into your deck. I think this is actually an outdated translation. Anyways, this allows you to recover supporter cards, and supporter cards are really good. I mentioned Boss's Orders, which is super good, but we're going to take a look at a good few more supporters in this list. I think 4 of the top 10 are supporters, so that's a lot. I think the other 6 are all items, so items are a little better than supporters, but Palpad is like so good. It's pretty insane. So, Palpad here is just going to be recovering, your supporters that draw you cards or your supporters that your Boss's Orders. Pretty much that's what it's doing. but those are so important. You want to play a supporter every single turn. So this is kind of like the idea of, you can play 2 of every Pokemon, or you can play 1 of every Pokemon and Super Rod. You can do the same with Palpad. It's a little different because supporters are much more difficult to search out than Pokemon, so it's not quite as true, but you can certainly get a lot of value out of Palpad in a lot of different scenarios. If we look at a deck like the Snorlax Stall, this is a good example. It's an okay example. We see a lot of supporters with only 1 copy of, but then we see 3 copies of the item card Palpad. Admittedly, some of these supporters are weird, but we see Boss's Orders, which, 1 copy. We see 4 copies of Counter Catcher. Snorlax Stall or Snorlax Control is a really weird deck, and its game style and game plan is so different than every other deck, but it does make great use of Palpad and allows you to play lots of different supporters. Then we look at like Lost Zone here. And it's also, this is a different use of it. Yes, we do have 1 copy of Boss Orders and 1 copy of Roxanne, but then you have 4 copies of Colossus Experiment. So this is kind of the opposite way, where you have 1 supporter that you're really focusing on, in this case, Colossus Experiment. It allows you to reuse this 1 supporter over and over and over again, so that you can get a ton of value out of it. So Palpad, really solid card that acts as almost like another supporter. And then Raging Bull Ogerpon, a third deck we'll take a look at here, and it runs Professor Sada's Vitality, 1 Iono, 1 Boss's Orders, which, you can recover those to reuse those twice, but you can use Professor Sada's Vitality, which you actually pretty much need on every single turn of the whole game, except for maybe like 1 turn. If things are going in a weird direction, maybe you can avoid it, but it's really important. So pretty much you're looking at, Palpadding back to Professor Sada's Vitality. And I've seen this deck played. I play this deck. That's pretty much what you do. You may Palpad back a Professor Sada's Vitality in a Boss's Orders or Iono if those are super useful in that specific game. Because Iono and Boss's Orders are super good. And Professor Sada's Vitality is good, but it's not making this list. And I'll tell you, Iono is. So yeah, really good there though. Palpad is probably. I don't know. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down below in the comments if you think Super Rod or Palpad is better. Of course, they're different cards, so not super comparable, but still really good. And next up, we have Professor's Research, and then we also have Iono and Arven. Arven's a little different, but Professor's Research is super simple. This one, oh wow, this is a lot of prints. But Professor's Research just says it's a supporter card. Discard your hand, draw 7 cards. Again, we have this. So I'm going to search up. So Professor's Research, you can see that there's a bunch of different, professors for it. We got, who's this? Professor Willow, Juniper, Sada, Turvo, Oak, Magnolia, Rowan, and so this is not, these aren't the same card. So Professor's Research is definitely a card that I expect to see in the game again for like 5 years from now, because they've been doing this thing where they have Professor's Research and then the professor's name after it as like a subtitle. And this one is really interesting. We saw Professor Juniper and Professor Sycamore, where you couldn't play both Professor Juniper and Professor Sycamore in the same deck, because they're the same card and it's a really good card. We also have, you can't play Boss's Orders and Lysander in the same deck because they're really good, although admittedly you really don't need like more than 4 copies of Boss's Orders, but Professor's Research, you might want more than 4 copy, because discarding your hand, drawing 7 cards is super good. You start the game with 7 cards in your hand. That's enough to get something going. It's not always enough to get exactly what you want, but it's enough to keep going. And so if you have 7 cards every turn, you're going to keep going. And if you just play Professor's Research every turn, you're going to keep going. Of course, discarding your whole hand can be risky. There's a card, Carmen, which is discard your hand, draw 5 cards, which is 2 less than this, of course. So it has an upside. You can play it the first turn of the game. However, drawing 2 less cards means that with that 5-card hand, there's a much lower likelihood of you getting like the stuff that you need, because you need, I don't know, probably another Professor's Research, and then you need your Pokemon energies, whatever, your combo pieces, your attackers, all that good stuff. And so just drawing lots of cards. Professor's Research just draws the most cards. There are other cards that can kind of draw more than Research, but not really consistently. I can't think of anything. Of course, with this, you're drawing random cards from the top of your deck, so there is no guarantee that you'll get exactly what you need. But Professor's Research it's really good. It's, I think, a little worse now than it has been at certain points in the history of the Pokemon TCG. It's really important in decks that are built to be fast, or decks that want to discard cards. So taking a look at the decks that play it, just these 8 decks here, the Gardevoir deck, as well as Lugia Archeops, and Regidrago. Those all want certain cards in the discard pile. You're looking at energy cards, Pokemon, and yeah, entry cards are Pokemon. So Professor's Research is really good there. But then you look at Miraidon, Future Iron Hands, and Future Iron Hands again, which is they're kind of similar. They actually both play Miraidons, just different ones. And then they both play Iron Hands EX, but they're what are generally described as turbo decks, which are decks that just want to discard. Well, they don't necessarily need to discard, but they are okay discarding. You generally can play all the cards from your hand, and then you want to just draw through your deck as quickly as possible. So Professor's Research is best in those style of decks, but so if the metagame is focused on either one of those style of decks, then Professor's Research will be better. But if it's focused on decks that are slower paced and need to conserve resources, it's potentially a bit of an issue. But there's also Pal Pet and Super Round, which just recover your cards, so it's not that big of a deal. Even if you have an amazing card with amazing hand with all the cards you need, you can play Professor's Research, and you're not necessarily. It's probably better just to not play Professor's Research there if you already have all your cards, but you can certainly play Professor's Research and then recover most of those cards. As I said earlier, you can't really recover items, pool special energy, or stadiums that easily, but generally those aren't super important to your game plan outside of maybe special energies. There are some tools that are pretty nice and stadiums and special and items, but generally those aren't like super deck defining. It depends on the deck a little, but generally you're okay discarding just your hand. So Professor's Research, a lot of people are very scared of discarding your hand. Trust me, it's not that bad. The better you get, and I'm saying this some because I have experience, but some because I have experience in just like making mistakes, and there are ways in which I'm not good enough to make full use of this. But as you get better, you'll understand that it is okay to discard stuff and what stuff it's okay to discard and not. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But then we have Iono. Iono is a really powerful supporter card. It says each player shuffles their hand, puts it on the bottom of their deck, and if either player draws any cards, puts any cards in the bottom, which by the way, I've never seen anyone try to Iono when neither player has a hand, but or when your opponent doesn't have a hand and your hand is just Iono. I've never seen that happen. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that, but I've never seen either player have any cards in hand. But then each player draws a card for each of their remaining prize cards. This is slightly different than the card N, which, by the way, N, I kind of don't like that card because it's really hard to search for in the database. Like if I just search N here, I don't think it's showing up. Yeah, so if I search here, you could see it here, but then N, it just has every card that starts with the letter N. So that's not exactly ideal. But N is essentially the same thing, except each player shuffles their hand into their deck, as opposed to putting it on the bottom of their deck. This gives you a bit more deck knowledge, Iono, because it allows you to what's on the bottom of your deck. You're not going to draw anytime soon, assuming you don't shuffle your deck. It has some really advanced use cases or like things you can do with it, but it doesn't really affect gameplay that much. Also, it means that you can't just Iono yourself into like the same cards you just saw, which is nice. But yeah, Iono is really good. It has two big use cases. It's either a draw supporter, which obviously just draws you lots of cards, especially in the early game before you've taken any knockouts. And in the late game, it puts your opponent down to a low hand size. Of course, it's generally going to be putting you to a low hand size in the late game and your opponent down to a big hand size or up to a big hand size in the early game. But generally, those aren't massive issues. You need to play carefully, though, and just like Counter Catcher, it's better in decks where you're trying to make a comeback. As I said earlier, I play Control, and Iono is really good in Control because it lets you just it's so unbalanced. You just put your opponent down to a low hand size and you to a big hand size. It's so broken. Admittedly, there is another supporter that's played more in Control that's more precise, but Iono is so good and a little underrated. But also harder to use because you don't get exactly what you want. But it's really good. As I said, in the early game, you need to be careful to not help out your opponent, but generally it doesn't help him out that much. You don't want to ever put yourself into a scenario where you're saying that, oh, my opponent, if they Iono me, I'm in a good spot, but if like they don't, then I'm in a bad spot. So generally your opponent's going to have a good hand if you're going to Iono. It might not be a perfect hand, it might be lacking certain things, but unless they're in a particularly unlucky scenario, then you can Iono them. Of course, there are some circumstances where your opponent is very unlucky, but all you have is Iono, so you are forced to Iono them or not Iono, and so either you help out your opponent to get yourself set up, or you're both just not setting up. But at the end of the day, it's still better to be in that position where you can make that decision than to just not be in that position. So Iono still like super super good. And the late game disruption thing where you force yourself down to a low hand. That one is a little sketchy and a little bit more luck based, where each player is put down to a low hand size. So every single card you're going to draw is going to make a much bigger impact on the game. But still, you can generally build your deck where you can draw out of low hand sizes. But as I said, you can't control what you get with Iono, but you can, or Professor's Research, but you can with Arven. This is a supporter that's a little weird. It searches for an item in a tool card. This was this is a card that was really used to push the new tool rulings with the Scotland Violet era, where tools are now no longer item cards, which is fine. I mean, it's cool, but Arven is obviously, getting you an item and a tool. So you need to make good use of both of them. Except you don't. A lot of decks don't make very good use of the tool. If we look at, let's see what decks play it. So we got Gardevoir, Snorlax, Miraidon, Charizard DX, and Iron Hand DX. Let's take a look at. Oh wait, no. Let's take a look at Snorlax. No, let's take a look at Miraidon. So Miraidon plays a few different tools. It plays a Rescue Board, 2 Bravery Charms, and a 4 Seal Stone. Except for Rescue Board and Bravery Charm just aren't that good. I mean, they're okay. They're certainly solid cards, but they're not that good. But 4 Seal Stone is insane. This is arguably the reason why Arven sees play. It just lets you search for a card, essentially, assuming you have a Pokemon V in play. And then you can get the items. The items are always really good, including Ultra Ball and Nest Ball, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, which allow you to search for your Pokemon. But yeah, super good. We see items like Buddy Buddy Poffin, Earthen Vessel, Super Rod, as well as Palpad, which I mentioned earlier, Enhanced Hammer, Hisuian Heavy Ball, Counter Catcher, Unfair Stamp, or Prime Catcher, the 8 specs. And it's just, getting an item is so good. We also see Technical Machine Evolution. There's a few Technical Machines, the best of which is Technical Machine Evolution. And Arven can get you that to help you get set up. There are a number of very solid tools, but the best one by far being 4 Seal Stone. But Arven's tool search is really nice, but getting the items so good. And then also, let me pull up one last deck list, which is going to be a Charizard deck, Charizard Pidgeot here. We see a bunch of different Stage 2s. Stage 2 decks need rare candy. This can get your rare candy. So it smooths out your deck, and this is commonly played in Control. We can get higher value out of tools, where you can play HP buffing tools and get just a ton of value there, as well as just some other weird cards. Because Control traditionally has the game's not built for Control. It kind of is, but not entirely. So they're cards that you can use in ways that they are intended to be, and then just get a lot of value in just weird ways there. But Arven can do that. That's again, I've discussed Control a lot on my channel, but yeah, pretty much Arven, super good. It's just weird. I think it's a little overrated, but it's undoubtedly one of the best supporters in the game. The top 5 are, well, the top 4 are the 4 supporters that I showed in this video: Professor's Research, Iono, Bostasaurus, and Arven. I think Bostasaurus and Iono are clearly the top 2. You could put them in either order. They're pretty different. And then Professor's Research and Arven are probably 3 and 4. I could make an I could see an argument maybe that they're not quite that high, but certainly universally they're really good. And Arven's really good. Not played in every deck. There's certainly decks that don't get a ton of value out of it, but it's not like bad there still. But then, as I mentioned earlier, Ultra Ball, Nest Ball. These might be the best 2 cards in the game. It's Nest Ball, search your deck for basic Pokemon, put it onto your deck or onto your bench. And then Ultra Ball, discard 2 cards from your hand. This is the issue where discarding cards is awkward. And you search your deck for a Pokemon, reveal it, put into your hand, then shuffle your deck. But the better you play, the better this becomes, because you'll know what cards you need and what cards you don't need in a certain matchup or game, just based on how it's going. Of course, for a new player, it's still not that hard to use. Just discard the stuff that you don't think you need. Or don't play it if you need all the stuff in your hand. But generally, you don't need all the stuff in your hand, and you really need a Pokemon from your deck, because you need your Pokemon to be set up and actually attacking. So this gets any Pokemon from your deck. Nest Ball gets any basic Pokemon. Every deck in the game plays basic Pokemon. It's literally the rule of the game. This is in so many decks. This is so good. Look at this. We're only a small fraction of the way through the decks. There we go. That's halfway. But this is every deck in the game. You scroll through the tournaments. It's not every deck, but it's most decks. The only reason it's not in every deck is probably because of Ultra Ball and Buddy Buddy Poffin. If those weren't in the game, it would definitely be in every deck. There's a card called Quick Ball, which is a mixture of Nest Ball and Ultra Ball. The big downside of Nest Ball, in my opinion, is that it puts the Pokemon straight onto your bench as opposed to into your hand. This means that if you're playing Gapesha, Bog, and Hisuians, or in the Hisuians or V-Star deck, or if you're playing Lumineon V, if you're playing The big thing is Luminion V, that it doesn't trigger the ability because it needs to be played from hand, not from deck. But whatever, that's not that count. I mean, it happens, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. Ultra Ball can allow you to do that, and of course, it gets any Pokemon, so it can get Evolution Pokemon, which is really really good. This card's also played in almost every deck. We see it's from the tournament, played in second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Apparently not eighth, but it's played in ninth and 11th. Um, Sorry, what was the eighth place deck? Why, how is this not playing? Oh, eighth place. Yeah, yeah. Eighth place was Lost Zone. First place was Lost Zone. So those are decks that are literally all basic Pokemon. But then Rhydon's also a deck that's all basic Pokemon. It still runs Ultra Ball. So Ultra Ball is super good. It's not like, I don't know if it's broken. It's really good. Like calling a trainer card broken is kind of weird because um, I don't know, but Ultra Ball is like so good. It literally just gets you every Pokemon, and then discarding the two cards usually isn't that big of a deal, especially because Pokemon can just bail you out of most hands. In certain formats that we've seen in the past, a Pokemon literally just completely bails you out of a hand. That doesn't really happen right now. You can get Luminion V to get a supporter to bail you out, but you do have to use your supporter for the turn, which can cause issues, but it's not that big of a deal. Nest Ball won't even let you use Luminion V, but these cards are so good. They just get you all your Pokemon. They're super good, and you need them in like every deck. So yeah, those are my top 10. I rambled on a bit, but I went to teaching mode. These are the things that these are things that are really useful to know when to use these cards because they're useful in most decks. Arven, better for slower decks, and I don't know, arguably for slower decks, but it can be used in fast decks, and research generally used for faster decks, but make sure you have lots of trainers in your decks as well. But anyways, also you can check out my video on how to build a deck, but that's really useful. I think it has a lot of good info in there. It's a short video, but if you just follow that, that will allow you to make any top deck. It's not super specific in everything, but I think it's really useful. But that's all for today's video. Consider liking, subscribing, and then of course commenting down below other cards you'd add to this list. Other cards I'd consider adding would be um, Judge. I had Buddy Buddy Poffin, which I mentioned, Earthen Vessel, and I think that's it. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of really good cards in the game, but these are so good. But I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'm excited to see you in the next video.